Tēnei au e tuaki nei, he uru o Ngāti Kahungunu. Tū au ki te maunga o whakapūnake, huri aku titiro ki ngā wai o te rohe o Wairoa, te Wairoa ho pūpū, ho nengenenge, mātangi rau te awa, e rere atu ki te moana nui a kiwa. Nō reira kia koutou, no te moana nui a kiwa, koutou hoki ngā iwi takitaki o te ao, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou. Thank you very much. It's a great honour and a privilege to be here, and so thank you very much for the invitation to talk. Manaia said that we might learn something about philanthropy. I'm certainly hoping to, because I know nothing at all about philanthropy, and I'm just a humble doctor, and I'm keen to learn. So kia ora. Yeah, and I guess my story, I come from Ngāti Kahungunu, a place on the east coast of the North Island here in Aotearoa. I grew up down in Hawke's Bay, came into, I guess, into this area through medicine. So I studied medicine up in Auckland, and eventually got to a point where I couldn't see the point of carrying on with, I was working in South Auckland, which for those of you who aren't from here may not know is a very deprived part of Auckland. Working in paediatrics and just seeing lots of Maori and Pacific kids coming in with clearly preventable health conditions, and got me to thinking there has to be a better way of trying to address these problems. And being probably quite young and idealistic at the time, I decided to go into public health medicine and looking at what can we do to try and address the conditions that are contributing to poor health, to try and promote health. And I don't know if we've achieved much, but it seems to me that we're working in a better space than just the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And that got me into thinking about environmental determinants of health, and so those things in the environment that contribute to either making us healthy or not. And that's led me to really engage with this idea of climate change and the links between climate change and health, which I think are incredibly important. And particularly now, I think having kids, I've got 3 young boys, kind of just reinforces that and makes that even more critical. And so I'm hoping to share just some thoughts with you about climate change and about particularly what I'm going to talk about is how effectively I see climate change as just another chapter in this ongoing saga of colonization, right? And so if we want to do something about that, we need a decolonizing approach, and we need to invest in ways that are going to undo or dismantle the systems and structures of colonization that have contributed to not just to climate change, but also to the situation we find ourselves in as Indigenous peoples, of bearing the brunt of the effects of climate change, and also being in the position of not being able to adapt because of a number of different issues. So I'm really pleased to be here at Te Wānanga o Raukawa. I'm embarrassed, utterly embarrassed to say I've never been here before, so I look forward to picking up on some of the good vibes. I work at the University of Auckland in Te Kupenga Hauora Māori, which is the Department of Māori Health, and I have to say in our institution, just between you and me, in our institution there's not always good vibes. It's not always a good, positive and uplifting, mana-enhancing place to be Māori. Okay, so kia ora, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and share some time with you. Okay, should get onto my slides, shouldn't I? I think the point I come at this from is as a health professional, and really seeing climate change as the defining health issue of our generation, and particularly for the next century. It's been recognised as such by some of the world's leading health authorities and medical journals, etc. And really, when we think, a lot of people will then question, what's climate change got to do with health? Surely that's about doctors and nurses fixing people. Climate change is about the environment and polar bears and stuff like that. we see enormous and clear connections between environmental change caused by climate change leading on to health outcomes through a number of different pathways. And so we've got more direct things and obvious things like extreme weather events, serious heat, like heat waves causing health outcomes, but also much more indirect things, and you'll see some of those depicted on the slide here, thinking about change in disease patterns, such as mosquito-borne illnesses that will become more common, might even be seen here in Aotearoa, leading on into food and water insecurity, and all the health problems that arise from scarce resources, conflict, all sorts of things. Forced migration, this won't be news to too many people. So, how did we get ourselves into this pickle? I think most people will be fairly familiar with the reasons behind climate change, but effectively, it is about our economy. It is about the way we rely on burning of fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions contributing to a warming of the planet with lots and lots of different impacts. And when we think about that, those impacts are not borne equally. And in fact, the contribution to climate change is certainly not equal. And so we see in this kind of distorted view of the map of the world, those countries that have contributed most to greenhouse gas emissions, to climate change, are blown up. And so you'll see there Europe, the United States in particular, really disproportionately represented. You can hardly even see continents like Africa and some of the poorer areas of the world because they've hardly contributed at all to climate change. And yet when you look at what the impacts are going to be, and this graph shows expected deaths from certain conditions related to climate change, you'll see the impacts are pretty much, all borne by the countries in the poorest parts of the world, Africa, Indian subcontinent, etc. Those that have contributed least to climate change. And so you've got this real moral crisis going on. And in fact, if you could show it, Indigenous peoples would be in here as well as being the hardest hit by climate change without having really done anything much to contribute. And so this is why I like to talk about climate change as really as an intensification of the process of colonisation. It's really, in a way, nothing new to us as Indigenous peoples. It's colonisation in its latest sort of guise. And, this is one of the ways I like to think about colonisation is colonisers thinking they know best and thinking they've got all the solutions, when, as I'll talk about today, we have the solutions, and Indigenous peoples have an enormous contribution to make, not just in addressing the climate change issues for ourselves, but in a global context. Because one of my key messages here is that colonisation and climate change are really strongly interlinked. Okay, so the process required to get to the situation we are today required confiscation and appropriation of land and other resources, which led on into modern capitalism, which required energy in the form of fossil fuels, leading to industrialisation, leading on into the situation we have here today with situations like land being taken for mining, resulting in huge problems with climate change. Okay, and so these things are very clearly linked. And so in New Zealand we see, as Miriana's already talked about this morning, huge loss of land, okay? And that land being taken over to, in effect, create an economy which contributes to huge greenhouse gas emissions. In many other parts of the world, it's an economy based on fossil fuels, In New Zealand here in particular, a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. And so that land shift, that environmental change from native forests to farmland, a huge part of that was, that was a huge driver for colonisation. But it's also been a huge driver for the kinds of environmental changes and leading on to climate change that we've seen here in Aotearoa. Okay, so these processes of colonisation are necessary to create the conditions by which we then face the effects of climate change. Myself and a group of others have undertaken some work looking at climate change from the perspective of health, and particularly from the perspective of the right to health for Māori. And this is another way that we can look at it that actually shows, again, how climate change and colonialism are linked. And so we see that the impacts of climate change on Māori health are incredibly disproportionate. Okay, greater burden of chronic disease, leading to worse health outcomes for Māori. Vulnerability because of living in poor conditions, poorer housing and infrastructure, access to healthcare, things like that. These things all increase the risk. Cultural practices that expose us to greater risk because of climate change. All these things are really important in determining why Māori experience worse outcomes and are likely to experience even more disproportionate outcomes as climate change advances. Okay, and so some people will say, oh, it's just bad luck that Māori happen to live in the areas that are going to be worst affected and maybe don't have the resources. But if we look particularly historically, but also in an ongoing way, we can see that there's no coincidence there. These risk factors have been driven by the process of colonisation. So our analysis looking at climate change from a right to health perspective showed that there are really important areas where the New Zealand government's failing to meet its obligations, and it must address climate change as an urgent issue, but also without infringing on the right to health for Māori, okay? Upholding Māori rights and supporting Māori with adaptation. And really importantly, as I'll go on to talk about, that this needs to be underpinned by not an ongoing reinforcement of colonisation, but an approach which allows for Māori self-determination and actually recognises and prioritises Indigenous knowledges. And also just a little aside to say that we mustn't think about colonisation as something that happened back in the day and that we're now experiencing the ongoing effects of. This is something that's our constant companion, and as Miriana's already talked about, we need to make sure that the next generation is going to be continuing this fight, because the forces massed against us aren't giving up. Okay, so we need to focus on this as an ongoing battle. And a battle it is. And it's really important that we recognise that Indigenous peoples are often, and in fact in many parts of the world, at the forefront of this battle. We tend to have the most skin in the game. We're often the first and worst affected by climate changes, as you can see in these examples. Often the ones with the least voice as well, and the least ability to actually do something about it because of the political power. And so we see examples like Standing Rock, where Indigenous peoples are actually fighting the fight for all of their population. They're standing up against the forces that will not only interfere with their own lands, not only destroy their own territories and resources, but those companies and those interests that will actually contribute to climate change and destroy all of our futures. Okay, so one of the key messages that I'm trying to get across is that we all need to see this as something that's not going to be a simple fix, but something where there's going to be these battles, and it's going to come down to battles over coal mines, over pipelines, over all sorts of different resources around the world. And Indigenous peoples will be there at the forefront of those battles, and we need to be standing beside Indigenous peoples all over the world to continue this fight. Okay, so slight diversion now, just to think about what do we need to do as a global community to tackle climate change. So it really comes down to quite a simple equation in many people's mind, and that is that we have a limited amount of carbon or greenhouse gas emissions that we can emit if we want to stay within a safe level. And a lot of people talk about 2 degrees Celsius warming above pre-industrial levels as a safe level. Even that is associated with considerable risk. So we shouldn't necessarily think, oh yeah, as long as we're staying under 2 degrees, we'll be sweet. This is a situation where we actually need to be doing as much as we can, as fast as we can. Because as you can see there, we've already used up the vast majority of our carbon budget. We've only got enough for, at the present rate, another 15, 20 years or so. So we need to be doing something really, really dramatically. And when I say dramatically, I do mean this is a situation of extreme urgency. And in fact, many of the medical authorities and medical journals are referring to climate change as a medical emergency. Not because we're seeing huge catastrophic health outcomes now, but because if we don't act now, we will see those in a very short space of time. And this graph here shows that the longer we take to start acting, the more dramatic and the more radical that action is going to have to be. So you can see there that our global greenhouse gas emissions are tracking upwards over time and following on through that dotted line to show the projections. And the longer we continue on that line, the more quickly we're going to have to reduce them. So you can see that if we go to that far extreme, you've got this almost impossible kind of turning around from huge greenhouse gas emissions down to zero in a very short space of time, which seems almost impossible. So if we're going to keep to this safe limit, we need to start acting now. We need to peak greenhouse gas emissions, start trending downwards. How do we do that? Well, I mean, the conventional wisdom says that we need to transform energy from fossil fuels, from coal, oil, gas, etc., to renewable energy. From an Indigenous point of view, we might think about that in quite a different way. We might think, rather than this finite carbon budget and emissions and all these fancy ways of thinking about it, we might just actually think from an Indigenous perspective that this is about actually those relationships that we have with the natural world. For us here in Aotearoa, we often talk about ranginui, papatuanuku, and whakapapa connections back to the land, back to points of significance, cultural sites of significance, so that we don't see ourselves as separated from that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Because at the moment what we're seeing is these continued upward trends in greenhouse gas emissions, okay, which if we take no action will lead us up to 4.5 degrees warming. We don't even want to consider that. That's horrendous. That'll be an incredibly hostile environment in many, many parts of the world and result in enormous suffering and perhaps, could even be an existential threat. In other words, threaten the existence of the human populations. If we go with what's currently promised by governments, we end up with 3.5 degrees, which is okay, an improvement, but it's nothing like what we need. If we manage to improve those commitments, we'll end up down on that bottom line with just under 2 degrees warming. That, I have to say, at the moment seems unlikely. given the way we're trying to solve the problem. And why do I say it's unlikely? Partly because of this gentleman, but also because of what he represents. Clearly a denier of global warming, wanting to enact policy and put in place changes that will undermine a whole lot of the efforts that are going on, not just in America, but also globally, to address climate change. And in many ways, I see this as sort of like the ultimate conclusion of Western civilization. You know, a situation and a leader where nothing matters except economic growth and the continued exploitation of resources to achieve that, despite all the negative outcomes. And so what I'm suggesting is that if we follow down the track of Western style approaches to climate change, which is the very system of thought that got us into the problem in the first place, we're not going to get anywhere. Because even some of the solutions to climate change that are adopted by Western nations, by some of our leaders, are incredibly detrimental to our environment. I've got an example here of a hydro dam from Panama, but this could be an example from many, many places around the world. Okay, so this is an attempt to address climate change, okay, by providing renewable energy through renewable electricity through a hydro dam, but it's gone and flooded and essentially destroyed local Indigenous peoples' lands. We can think of a number of other examples of this, be it mining, be it dams, be it pipelines, any number of things which contribute to environmental contamination of Indigenous peoples' lands. But this is troubling also because it shows us that even if we're trying to address climate change, doesn't mean we're going to be doing that in a way that upholds Indigenous peoples' rights. Okay? Colonisers still going to colonise, whether they're trying to fix climate change or trying to make it worse. You know, so we need to approach this from a much different perspective. And that's why I like this quote. I think this Albert Einstein, he had a lot of good things to say, and he was a bit of an expert on Maori and Indigenous issues, I think. He said something like that no problem can be solved within the same level of consciousness that created it. And if we think about climate change, then what's created that is this philosophy of Western civilization, of seeing ourselves as superior to the natural world and removed from it. And therefore, the way we engage with that is to exploit and to take resources, to pollute. And if we're going to continue down that track of trying to fix the problem within the same level of consciousness, I'm saying that we're not going to get very far. And I think that we need to think about this as, actually, climate change is one of those things that's telling us that there's something really, really wrong with the way we're living. And I think we heard it this morning, even in the pōwhiri, that the world we live in is sick, okay? The approach we're taking globally and in terms of engaging with the natural world is contributing to that. And we need to turn that around. We need to hit the restart button and think about how we can address things quite differently. And that's where I come to Indigenous knowledges as what I see as part of, if not the, solution to addressing climate change and a lot of the environmental impacts that we're seeing. So obviously I'm not the only person thinking this, because there's the Australians, they think they could save the world, we think we can save the world, hopefully everyone thinks they can save the world, because we have a different way of engaging. And I think Miriana talked about it, seeing the world through Maori eyes or through Indigenous eyes. If we can actually claim that space, we can engage with these things in a much different way than is traditionally being done. It's to do with this really quite different way of engaging with the world, and I think many of you will be totally familiar with this, that Indigenous cultures pay deliberate attention to the way in which the natural world speaks to us. Whereas from a Western perspective, and I don't mean this to say that everyone who's a Westerner kind of thinks like this, but from a Western cultural perspective, we see ourselves as removed from that, and that rather than the world speaking to us and informing us, we see ourselves as being dominant and attempting to dominate the world and conquer. Okay, very, very different perspectives. And I'm not going to read out this whole quote, but I'll leave it up there. I really think this captures what we're trying to talk about here. I like the way the dust on which you now stand responds more lovingly to their footsteps than to yours, because it is rich with the blood of our ancestors. Just some of the language in there is really, really nice. Bare feet, conscious of the sympathetic touch. Okay? That very different way of and in fact, really visceral way of connecting with the world. And because actually, from a Maori perspective and from many other Indigenous perspectives, we see relationships between ourselves and non-human things, like the environment, like other creatures, as not different from relationships with humans. We see that interdependence, that interrelationship of our whakapapa. And so, in a Maori context, and you might have noticed that I did this morning, was to connect myself to some places where I'm from. And I used to think, I grew up in a fairly mainstream, if you like, whānau. Wasn't exposed to a lot of Maori stuff growing up. And I used to think when I went along to some hui and things and people would be introducing themselves by talking about their mountain and their river and their who knows whatever else, I used to think, what a bloody waste of time that is. Why don't they just tell me, I'm John from Hastings or whatever. And so, yes, I was pretty bad Māori, I have to say. But it's only more recently struck me that not only are those things important, they're actually critical to our ongoing survival as people. If we lose those connections, if we lose those intimate connections with the natural world, we end up in a situation where we just see the earth and all its resources as commodities that we can exploit for our own good, for our own well-being. And we lose the sense of that interdependence. And we end up doing stuff like what Donald Trump wants us to do, burning lots of carbon and contributing to the problems that are going to really, really hurt us coming down the track. So, yeah, rather than this being, just frivolities that people like to rattle off and, say all these places where they're from and connections to this river and that lake and whatever else, this is critical stuff for our survival. Okay. Only just occurred to me not that long ago. But we see that in the way that people talk. Indigenous people. So I'm the river and the river is me. Really interesting in that, the Whanganui River just recently been given sort of legal personhood. First river in the world, apparently. And, non-Māori people will look at that and go, what? How can a river be a person? What if someone drowns in there? Do they get taken to court and put in jail or whatever? And just don't have that understanding of the way of thinking of that as our ancestor and as something that needs to be treated as such. So yeah, really, really important connections. And we see these kinds of things coming through in Indigenous initiatives. And so one of the things I want to just talk about very briefly as a specific example of what I'm talking about is marae food gardens. Okay, it's one of the projects that I've been involved in my research at the University of Auckland, and it's great to see Panapa here who worked on our project with us for a little while. Looking at marae food gardens, community food gardens on marae. and looking at not just the health benefits, but also the way in which that can contribute to reinvigoration of cultural knowledge, the whakawhanaungatanga, building connections amongst people, environmental impacts, food sovereignty, which we're going to hear more about during the conference. So these things, by looking at this and by putting these things in place in an Indigenous context, we can help to address many of the factors that are contributing to some of the bad stuff we see, like climate change. Okay, these are photos from one of the marae that we've been working with, Papatuanuku Kōkiri Marae in South Auckland, and shows some of their produce as well, just doing some awesome mahi there. So what I think that we need to do in addressing climate change, but also at the same time by upholding Indigenous people's rights, is to take a decolonising approach. In other words, to look at what are those things that are contributing to the impacts of climate change, but also contributing to the marginalisation of Indigenous peoples. And we've already seen some of those things talked about this morning, about the confiscation of land, the systematic dispossession of language and culture, stolen generations kind of things. All those kinds of things which actually take away those resources that we need to be able to respond to climate change and to be able to respond to lots of other things. Okay, so in our work and thinking about how we address climate change, how we address a number of the different issues for Indigenous peoples, we need to think about a way that dismantles those structures, those systems, those institutions that contribute to Māori being dispossessed of those things, and to other Indigenous peoples similarly. Okay, as I mentioned before, we need to recognise that Indigenous peoples are fighting this battle in many places around the world. That we're at the forefront of this battle, that climate change is not going to be won by the governments sitting in their negotiating rooms in the in the conference of the parties and the climate change negotiations. It's going to be won at the local level, and every community doing its thing, every community standing up against fossil fuel exploration, oil drilling, etc., etc. And we need to be supporting those efforts by Indigenous peoples and standing alongside. So, in summary, what I've talked about today, climate change, and the way I like to think about it, is really, in a sense, nothing new for Indigenous peoples, because we've always been, since colonisation, always been exposed to the impacts of environmental change, forced migration off our lands, dispossession of resources, all these sorts of things that come about in a similar way to what's happening with climate change. Furthermore, the impacts of colonisation actually stop us from doing the things that we need to do, not only to help us respond to climate change, to use our Indigenous knowledges to create the kind of change that we need to reduce our emissions, to live in a much more sustainable way, but also to adapt to the impacts of climate change, which we're going to have to do. And so taking a decolonisation or decolonising approach is the only way we're actually going to address climate change, not just the issues for Indigenous peoples, but the only way we're actually going to address climate change at a global level as well. And one really important point is that investing in Indigenous communities, Indigenous cultures, Indigenous knowledges is a really critical part of that. Okay, I believe if we're going to solve climate change, it's going to rely on Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous solutions to the problem. Those things that have been seriously repressed by the impacts of colonialism, and therefore the things that we need to uncover reinvigorate and prioritise and support if we're going to come up with the solutions that we need at a local, national and global level to help us address climate change and to give us a future that we can at least look forward to with some hope. Nō reira, kia ora tātou.